Hey everybody, Tim Anderson here, aka Renfell. Welcome to the first episode of the Mondays in Middle Earth show, which is a new thing that I'm doing here on YouTube. If you love all things Middle Earth, you're in the right place. We're going to be starting off with The Hobbit and then working our way through the Lord of the Rings books, the Silmarillion, and beyond as we continue to analyze and discuss all things related to Tolkien and Middle Earth. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you stumbled upon this video by accident or by chance, that's awesome. Either way, welcome. And don't forget, if you like the video, make sure to like it, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon so that you can continue to get updates as we publish more of these. They come out every Monday at 11 a.m. Central. There's a lot of other stuff that happens here on YouTube, so don't forget to check out the other playlists. Discord links are down below, so on and so forth. We'll talk more about that stuff at the end, but now let's dive into The Hobbit. So, this was the first book I remember reading as a 5-year-old child. My dad gave me this book, and I read it. Immediately followed this up with the Narnia books, but the Hobbit was the first book that I have any recollection of reading on my own as a 5-year-old child. And it was a great read, a phenomenal read, and it got me firmly rooted in all things fantastical, a love of Middle Earth starting at a very young age. I then read Lord of the Rings when I was 7, and from the time I was 12 onwards, I read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings every year up until I was about 20 years old. And then I just got busy with life, and I have not read these books since I was 20. And now that I'm 42, with all of the stuff coming out around Rings of Power this fall, I'm very trepidatious about that show. If you've watched any of my Rings of Power stuff, you know this to be true. But it inspired me to want to read the books again because I hadn't done so in a very long time. And I don't claim to be a Tolkien expert by any means. However, I do have a passion for the books, and it definitely inspired me to become a writer. And it's been really nice getting back into things for the first time in many, many years. So, having reread The Hobbit now recently, there was a few things that struck me as stuff I didn't remember. And maybe it's just because the last time I read all these books, I was only 20 years old, and it was right before the films had come out, Peter Jackson's films had come out, and I don't think I've read them since then. So there's this part of me that was a 20-year-old kid the last time I read these, and even though I had a lot of passion for Tolkien and grew up with Middle Earth, I never dug into it beyond just being passionate about the books and the world and the Silmarillion and everything else. And at that point when I read it, it was cool to me to have read the Silmarillion, which I think I've only went through twice. And it was more of a way for me to one up my friends who were also reading Lord of the Rings and had never read the Silmarillion. So I would have these little facts that I'd be able to drop on them and be like, "Yeah, truth bomb, you didn't know that." But I've forgotten most of this stuff, and 22 years later, I have a much more analytical mind. Plus, I've now been established as a writer, making a living as a writer since 2008. So I have more than a decade, I mean, going on 15 years now of experience as a writer and as a world builder and creator and a game developer. So I have a lot more experience, which has given me a different perspective on these books. So one of the first things that I had obviously forgotten was the fact that the writing style for The Hobbit was so much different than The Lord of the Rings. Some of this was just because The Hobbit was written like, 12 years earlier, something like that. From what I was reading online, there were 17 years between the release of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. But it took him 12 years to write Lord of the Rings. So we're talking about something that originally was being written more than a decade before. And so it was also written in a different time in Tolkien's life, pre World War II, pre all these other things when his kids were still kids. And as I remember, this book was being written, sort of for lots of different reasons, but also as a source of enjoyment for his kids, as well. So the writing style in The Hobbit is very much designed so that a kid could read it. And that's something that I remember enjoying as a 5-year-old was it was very easy to get into. Now my brother has read the Hobbit to his son, my nephew, who's now 6. I believe they started that when he was 4 or maybe when he was 5. I'd have to ask my brother to confirm that, but let's say 5 years old. He hasn't read it on his own yet, but he's since last year they got him a Kindle and he's been reading Harry Potter books, and he's reading well enough along. But my brother read him The Hobbit. It was the nightly reading session over the course of a few months, and he really enjoyed the book. So The Hobbit is definitely something that kids can enjoy. And I had forgotten how much that writing style was designed for kids. It's a lot less dense than The Lord of the Rings is in terms of grammar and prose and the sentence structure and everything else. And that was something that I had forgotten. The other thing I'd forgotten was the continual use of foreshadowing, or basically things that are crop up in the text, like what Bilbo didn't know was this. And then immediately following that, we would talk about what this was, or it would be something that was going to happen 3 or 4 chapters later on. That is it's used a lot throughout the book, where and not just for Bilbo, for other things as well. You talk about the dwarves didn't know this, and then this happened here. So there was a lot of sort of foreshadowing of things to come in the book, and I don't remember that being a part of the Lord of the Rings. Again, I have not read these books in 22 years, so I'm going to be interested to see as I get into the Fellowship of the Ring if that aspect still holds true throughout the rest of the series, because in The Hobbit it happens a lot. It's definitely sort of this hook type of thing to keep the attention span of the reader and be like, don't go away because this is going to happen next, which I found was very interesting. Um, I love the sarcasm of Bilbo. I had forgotten about this. Like as he starts to get more sure of himself, which happens progressively. Kind of, I feel like the first moment when he really feels like he's becoming a true adventurer is when he rescues the dwarves from the spiders. And he's like, you know what? I've got this sword. I've got this ring. The ring got me out of problems in the Misty Mountains. Like, I'm gonna use it for these spiders. And he rescues the dwarves, right? And I feel like he kind of, with the trolls, was like inspired. He's like, well, they hired me as a burglar. I should try to do something burglary when he tries to steal the purse from the pocket of the troll, and he gets caught. So he doesn't do anything really epic at that moment because he gets caught during the process. But by the time we get to the spiders, he's feeling sure of himself. He's started to understand the power of the ring. He's got this magical sword, and he defeats some spiders, and that gives him courage. And then he goes from there into, uh, you know, just going from there in Mirkwood into the dungeons with the elves and rescuing the dwarves, and that just gives him more courage. So by the time we get to the Misty Mountain, or excuse me, the Lonely Mountain, and Thorin is nitpicking little different things, Bilbo snaps and he's like, just basically tells Thorin to stuff it. He's like, dude, I have rescued your guys' asses like half a dozen times now. You need to pony up and give me the respect and money that I'm due, and stop being such a whiny little dwarf. Which I thought was really interesting because he comes from being this little hobbit he's well to do, he's well off, he's got an inheritance, he's got a nice house that was given to him by his family. He has nothing to worry about, and his days are just basically being a well-to-do hobbit, smoking pipeweed and eating good food. And then suddenly he gets pushed out the door, and he's in the beginning stressed about handkerchiefs and all this other stuff. And by the end of it, he's going off and doing these adventurous things. And so I feel that that progression was very good. And that was something that I had forgotten, was the sarcasm that Bilbo has as he starts getting more sure of himself and starts telling the dwarves, stop being a bunch of whiny little pansies and suck it up. Because look at all the things that I'm doing. You guys are supposed to be more battle hardened than I am, so stop your whining. Um, what's interesting to me, though, one of the things that I had completely, maybe not even forgotten, but maybe I just never knew because I never dug into the history of this, because I don't remember this at all. I remember reading the Silmarillion and going, "Oh, this is awesome." It was published, after his death, but it's awesome that he had all of these world building notes and everything fleshed out. But what I didn't realize is that the setting of The Hobbit was something where originally it was meant to be this standalone novel. It says the setting of The Hobbit, and I'm pulling from the wiki here, as described on its original dust jacket, is an ancient time between the age of fairy and the dominion of man in an unnamed fantasy world, with the world on the end paper map shown as the western lands westward and the Wilderland to the east, And originally, this world was self contained, but as Tolkien began to work on The Lord of the Rings, he decided these stories could fit into the legendarium he had been working on privately for decades. The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings became the end of the Third Age of Middle-earth within Arda, and eventually those tales of the early periods began published as Silmarillion and other posthumous works. But what's interesting to me is if you look at the timeline, this is what fascinates me. Um, he had begun work on like the unfinished tales and sort of the world setting for the Silmarillion and everything else more than a decade before he ever started writing The Hobbit. And The Hobbit was meant to be this standalone thing. But as he got deeper into it and realized there was this interest for hobbits and everything else, he kind of went, oh, I can take this idea and I can put it into that world setting that I've been building for the last 15 years, and I can make it fit, and I can just kind of, you know, retro fix some things and kind of go back and reverse engineer a few other things. And so when I was reading through The Hobbit, and I don't know how much of this is from the original or when they did the revised edition after, because I know they revised the Riddles in the Dark chapter after, Lord of the Rings was published and everything else. But there are allusions to things like Moria, Gil-galad, the Necromancer, the Fall of Gondolin, and etc. throughout the Hobbit book, which just goes to show you that, originally when they published it, it was standalone, but then figuring out that it could fit into this world of Middle Earth and then going back and making revisions to that. I know a lot of people like to criticize, like George Lucas, for example, because he went back and did, basically fixing things in the original trilogy some 20 years later when the special editions came out in the mid to late 90s. And a lot of people criticize George Lucas for that, but I'm like, Tolkien did the same thing. Like, The Hobbit was a published book, and it was published in this version, and then he comes along, however many years later, 15, 20 years later, with the Lord of the Rings, and says, actually, I need to fix that and make that match up with this because I want to put it all in this same world. And I think he got away with it in a different way back then because everything was done much slower back then. So we didn't have the internet, we didn't have word processors, we didn't have instant communication. So the process of getting a reprint was something that was a great big long thing. And so and it also wasn't, I think, publicized as much as it would be today. Because can you imagine the uproar if Brandon Sanderson decided that he was going to go back and change a whole bunch of stuff in the original Mistborn trilogy because the third trilogy that he wrote has a bunch of things that he wants to change, and so now he's going to go back and change the first trilogy, the second trilogy to make it match the third trilogy, and then he does it again with like the sixth Mistborn trilogy 15 years down the road. You're going to piss off a lot of fans by doing that kind of stuff, but it's also the prerogative of the author as you're continually fleshing something out. So these are the things that I found fascinating reading through The Hobbit again for the first time in 22, 23 years. Um, how much of this was sort of started off as standalone and then it was like, oh, I can actually retrofit this and make it work in this other world that I've been working on for much longer, and I can create this greater arc of mythology. Really fascinating stuff. From a world building perspective, I kind of understand it because I've got with the Saga of Leucemia, things that are mapped out for years, but then as I'm writing in the moment, I come up with inspiration and I'm like, well, I could change that and change that. But I also feel like once a book is out the door, that's it, it's done. But I haven't gotten deep enough into a writing career like Tolkien had, where I have a book series that I feel like is going to be my magnum opus, and I need to make sure that it's perfect. So I'm triple checking, quadruple checking, and everything else. So it's fascinating stuff. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them down in the comments below. Don't forget, we do have a dedicated channel in our Discord server set up around the Mondays in Middle Earth series. So if you want to join and have conversations around these videos, don't forget to check the links below to the Discord server and you can join the channel that way. Prerequisite stuff now that we're at the end of the video is that if you'd like to support the channel, first and foremost, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you get updates for future content. You can subscribe as a member here on YouTube, or you can go over to Patreon. patreon.com/wandering hermits, and you can find everything about the world of the Weave and the Void, which is the world map behind me. It's created by myself, my brother, and my wife as we work on that world. We are the Wandering Hermits, and that is something that we've been working on since March of 2021. We also have Nathan Napalm with us working on character art, but it's a 5th edition tabletop setting. Books are out in June of 2022. There's a point and click game like King's Quest that's due out the end of 2022. You can download the free demo today. Sink your teeth into all the development updates, pre-order that game, all that stuff over on Patreon. Plus, there's a book series like Dragonlance with chapter art from Chris that's being published with chapters twice a month. Everything's done again, patreon.com/wandering hermits. So if you'd like to learn more about who I am as a game developer and as a writer, you can find more information about that world behind me. Otherwise, we'll see you in Discord, hopefully. If not there, then in the next video and hopefully over on Patreon as well. Stay safe, everybody. Happy reading. Until next time.